Welcome to Project Chatter, the podcast where PPM experts from various sectors talk about the latest trends. Listen to Val and Dale as they talk about tried and tested best practices and share their unfiltered thoughts about the industry. Whether you're here to learn how to progress your career, improve your project control skills, or just want to hear an Aussie and South African rant about projects, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Project Chatter podcast with your hosts, Dale Fung and Val Matthews.
In this episode, we speak to our good friend, Joe Lucas. Joe has over 20 years experience driving change across major organizations like Transport for London, HS2, UCL, and Network Rail. A former civil engineer turned bridge builder between teams and systems, she now helps organizations collaborate more intelligently through her work with Co-Create.
A TEDx speaker and REBA award-winning home builder, Joe challenges traditional thinking and champions the power of human connection to tackle the complex challenges of our time. She certainly did that, Val, on this episode. It was a thought exercise for all three of us, I think. Really challenged the way we looked at how organizations utilize external versus internal resources. What stood out for you?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about in-house, out-house, consulting, big and small. We talked about abstraction versus connection, which I really loved. We even talked about AI and what that might mean from a relationship or a connection perspective. And we really pushed the idea of in-house decision making, and I thought that was really useful. We always have fun with Joe, don't we? What about for you, mate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Joe is great, and she brings us real authenticity to the pod. Not that our other guests don't, but you can really hear it coming through in the way she considers everything she talks about and says. It's it's not a brain fart. She's put some deep thought into the aspects that she's brought to the table. So I think listeners will really be intrigued by this one because it's different. Yes, we do talk about, AI, we're in that age, but it's not focused on the AI bits. It's really different to a lot of the podcasts we've had recently. Folks, we'll leave it there. We won't spoil it too much for you. As we say, keep listening, keep liking, and keep paying it forward.
Good morning, good evening, Project Chatter. It's your friendly friends from the friendliest pace, Project Chatter podcast. It's always good to see you. I was thinking before we actually press record, it has been a while since we've seen Joe Lucas, but Joe, welcome back to the podcast, my friend. How are you?
Not bad. Thanks for having me again. It has been a while. I was trying to figure it out myself. I think
it's been years, yeah.
Mycelium last time. Lots of mycelium.
You were. It was actually one of my favorite podcasts because you explained it so well. It stuck in my head too, using kind of natural sciences to explain how we work in projects and in life. It's always interesting to catch up with you. And Dale, it's good to see you again, mate.
Yeah, likewise. Good to see you as well, Val. Joe and I catch up offline, so we see each other more regularly.
Jealous.
You're the other side of the pond. Actually, Joe, you actually guest hosted a couple episodes for us a while back. So, yeah, fond memories,
Take the cup, I made it easy.
Well, I think we should establish some definitions first because I think we're going to go into an interesting topic, and I've got some questions already. But we were talking kind of about resources, I guess, in a way. But you're talking about capability, Joe. Outsourcing and insourcing. What's kind of your general definition if people are asking?
Yeah, so I think everyone kind of gets the concept of what outsourcing is. And I was actually, in getting ready for the podcast, I was having a bit of a trip down memory lane myself in terms of how Co-Create came about, which was like 7-8 years ago now. We started with something called behavioral-based productivity. And that was always about doing more with less. So how can you do more with less? And I think outsourcing was kind of basically an outcome of that concept, not from us, but just in general. Everyone was trying to do more with less. And they were running by some pretty straightforward rules, which is private companies are much better than public, than government, much more efficient. So therefore, we should send things out to private companies and they'll be able to deliver it better. And bigger is better than small. So we should use big companies in order to do the work because they've got lots of capability and lots of capacity and they hold lots of knowledge. And so therefore, we should outsource to big companies. And that's kind of been a trend for quite a while within our world of consultancy. But actually, I get this sense that we're in a bit of a shift period. So there's a bit of a moment where the tide's turning. Lots of things, but I think slightly post-COVID, that had a bit of a shake-up on how much money. So we now need to do a lot more with a lot less. Post-boomer, we've lost huge amounts of knowledge out of the workforce, which has sort of accelerated some trends already. And then we've got the advent of AI, which is basically saying we can do things incredibly fast. And so some of those key skills of those rules seem to be no longer quite as well as they used to be. And then you've got an interesting concept coming out of someone like Mariana Mazzucato, where she's talking about, whereas before we used to look at the government stepping in for market failure, we're now looking at government shaping the future markets, and especially during these periods of intense change. And that indicates that you need to have that information to be, that knowledge to be in-house. In order to shape the market, you need capability and capacity in-house. In order to do more with less, you need it in-house. AI requires it to be in-house because you need to gather data and you need to gather knowledge internally in order to be able to create your own protected AI. So there's all sorts of reasons why insourcing seems to be something that's on the agenda, and it's something we're being asked to do a lot more, which is governments want to do it themselves, a bit of DIYing going on. And so then the question comes, what's the role of consultants now? What's the right scale of consultants? So for me, that's the key difference is outsourcing is you look for your capability and capacity externally and you buy it in. And insourcing is that you grow your own. And I think the risk is to make sure that you don't think you can just grow your own on your own. Just by saying we're going to do it in-house doesn't mean you have the capability in-house to do that. So it's being a bit more agile in how you think about, well, how do we build or rebuild our capability and capacity in-house?
Yeah. I'd almost add two more, Joe, to that definition around what I've seen in terms of behavioral change. And they're related to what you're saying, actually. One is a data sovereignty now, nationalism over globalization, in the sense that everyone's looking after their own patch because the world is quite fractured now in various relationships, so not as strong as they used to be in particular alliances. And there is this big threat of cyber and AI. So there is a lot more. Even last week or the week before, I was talking about AI sovereignty with a think tank in Australia, and that means you have to think internally first before you help others, which is not a bad thing. And the other thing is the job market has changed for what you used to offshore perhaps or outsource overseas. A lot of that transactional work effectively could be managed in-house now because of AI and other products and integrations, and doing less with more. That used to be an advantage because of the price differences in the global markets, but also because they could do it faster and they had the scale, et cetera, et cetera. Now it seems that's less required. So countries like India and Philippines and Vietnam will have much more pressure now because the service to go outsourcing or offshoring will be less. Sort of a prediction. But Dale, what do you think about that, mate? Have you seen something similar?
I don't know if I've seen something similar, but I was thinking while you were both chatting there's so many different factors that might influence insourcing. And if we think about what you were saying there, Joe, in terms of trends and potentially how outsourcing is outdated and perhaps insourcing is becoming the in thing. And if that's a behavior set and an attitude towards how we look at how we deliver stuff within an organization, then what influences that behavior? And, Val, you've always said on this podcast that people aren't their behaviors. They're, they behave within the environment they find themselves in with all these various influences. And so some of the influences that pop into my mind are, is it a generational thing where, hey, we can do this on our own, we are okay with technology? Is that shift? You say, we've lost the boomers and perhaps that was a different behavior set. Is it technology influencing us? Anyone can go onto ChatGPT and be an expert now because I can go ChatGPT, act as a project controller, and here's my data and tell me what it tells me. So maybe it's a bit of everything, or all of the above. But it's interesting. I mean, you've obviously mulled this over a little bit, Joe, and bringing this topic to the table. What are your thoughts in terms of what's influencing this behavior? And perhaps, is it a conscious, behavioral change, or do you think it's something that's sort of more subliminal?
As always with these sorts of things, there's a multitude of different things which are driving it. I believe what you were saying around Val, like this behavioural aspect is in response to what's going on in the environment. And there's a whole lot of factors going on in the environment, but that can all be kind of encapsulated in the concept of we're dealing in incredibly complex environments. And when you look at things through the lens of relationships rather than through the lens of things, we thought we could buy off the shelf from a consultancy a strategy and that would solve our problems. So if we just found the right strategy or the right technology or the right framework or the right policy, then suddenly we could actually, deliver significantly better results and that would work. But the reality is that it hasn't worked that way. What happens in reality is those strategies sitting on shelves getting dusty. And the real skill and the real issue is how do you actually implement those strategies? How do you turn that insight or that strategy into action? And how do you do it together with people within your organization such that it gets embedded and is believed in and is actually taken up? And it's something we all struggle with is when you're an external consultant, there's only so much you can do. I mean, we called ourselves co-create for a reason because the more we are doing it for others, the less likely it is to happen. The more that we're doing it alongside, that we're constantly transferring knowledge, that we're really providing kind of, we often call it a thinking partnership element. That's when this works. And I think the reality is that, and it's been a slow and painful reality because it's much easier if you think you can bring someone external in and they'll solve your problems for you. You've realized you have to do it yourself. Like the only way you can really create change in your organization, you may need someone alongside you. You may need to bring in specific expertise for certain elements. And I think there's when you deal with complex organizations, there's this really lovely diagram I found. I went on a regenerative engineering course and had this wonderful diagram, which had, when there's an acting force, you always have a resisting force. And the bigger the acting force or the activating force is, the bigger the resisting force is. And that reminds me of every single project I've ever done is, the bigger the change you want to create, when you call it a transformation, when you call it instead of a tweak, you get this massive resistance that you then need to overcome in order to do the work. And you either end up in some dreadful compromise or in those moments when you manage to align the stars, you sort of shoot off into higher potential of what the organization can become. And I think when you look at the work of someone like Donella Meadows, she always talks about leverage points. And it's something we believe heavily in is rather than trying to transform an entire system, I think we spoke about it last time, rip up the trees and put them in neat lines because neat lines is the latest thing. Or maybe it's circles this month, or maybe we need to put trees in triangles and that will solve the problem. And what we don't recognize is when we rip up the trees, we rip up all of those underground mycelial relationships. And that's the resisting force. You try and pull a tree out. It has some roots there that are really desperate to stay exactly where it is, because no matter how good that new location is, the impact of ripping those roots up is much greater than the benefit of a tiny bit of extra sunshine. And so strategic intervention lets you think about it a different way. Maybe you just take out a few of the trees which are taking up too much space, or maybe you just get rid of a bit of, bindweed. Maybe you give a bit of extra nutrients. It's knowing what are those strategic moments or those strategic intervention points where you can actually create the change. And that kind of knowledge only sits in-house. It may need someone to help draw it out. It may need others to sort of see it. But the reality is you understand your organization. And there was this really interesting, I had a chat this week with someone actually in government. And they, in the usual way of government, had been asked to do a 6-month secondment over in a completely different department and asked to lead a change in governance. That's not their expertise. They're quite self-effacing. I think they're actually perfectly good at governance, but they were sort of saying, I didn't really 100% know. And then they landed, they've given some volunteers because this is this DIY world. We're not going to get consultancy and we'll just give you some volunteers and we're going to figure out how to do governance over here. And then they really realized they didn't have a clue. So they pulled in a consultancy saying, come give us a hand, big consultancy. They said, we'd like to do this over a 12-month period so we can figure it out for ourselves. We'd like you to walk alongside us while we figure out what governance makes sense, because this is a highly complex department and it needs to fit into all sorts of different areas. We're in the middle of a transformation. It needs to tuck into that, blah, blah, blah. And the consultancy said it'd be much more efficient and much cheaper if we give you 5 consultants and we do it in 3 months. And everyone signed off on that. And in 3 months' time, they'll give them something ChatGPT could have probably done in 2 hours, wonderful slide deck, which explained how governance should work in there, which is sitting on a shelf and nothing's happened to it. And that to me really encapsulates the issue of outsourcing versus insourcing in this category, they couldn't keep on top of it. When there's 5 consultants running at 1,000,000 miles an hour and you're doing this as like a side gig, you can't spearhead each of the meetings. You can't co-create the change. You can't share your contextual knowledge. You can't explain where the roots are or what the relationships are or how it all ties together. And I think that's the learning we're getting, is we've continuously repeated the same mistake of getting, and I think ChatGPT has really brought that to the surface, that concept of, oh, actually, what I get from ChatGPT is pretty much as good as what I used to get from 5 consultants for 3 months. It's really at a high level now that in terms of best practice, it's pretty good at putting one of those together for you. It can't tell you what the relationships are within your organization.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that, actually. You're right. It's clever to the consultancy, right? They just brought their cash flow forward, but it's hard for government to take any accountability when they do this either. They struggle. There was something hot in the news just, I think it was last week. Deloitte was in trouble because they had to give a refund to the Australian government for a report that cost $440,000, and apparently a professor had found that it was completely false and it had been driven by ChatGPT. And it had false references and non-factual information. So they've been in hot water. A refund of $440K is not really a big deal for Deloitte, but the premise is still there. But then I kind of countered that with there's 2 parties there that are responsible for the outcome. Back to your point around co-creating. If they're blaming the consultants, they also have to blame the client for accepting something that was so wrong. Clearly there's a gap in verifying their own information. And it got me thinking, even if you have the right answer, insourcing and the capability, if you said they had your story there, they had no kind of internal capability or specialization in governance because it is complex. Would they even know what they were looking at if they've got the right answer from a consultancy? And there's a real trouble, at least with some of the government agencies I work with, where even if you gave them the answers, as you said, there's still this gestation period. The risk, I think, is everyone's looking for a perfect answer when they bring these things. Because I don't mind that they don't use big consultancies, because to be honest, I think consultancies should be a support function, not the leading function. But I also feel like they want so much from a consultancy or external factors. They don't weigh in on tripping over. When you watch your child learn to walk or something, the fall is as important as the walk itself. The stumbles and the trip overs and all the mistakes they make, they have to roll forward. Obviously, you can't stop, but you need to make room for human error. And we don't factor that into any planning. Usually, it's only people like yourself and me, Dale, that, I was going to say the people on this call, maybe, but it's not a considered factor, especially when you're pricing a service. You say, oh, well, there's probably going to be a bit of a fumble in about month 3 when everyone goes, what the hell is this? How do you what's your tactic for, and I'm getting to the tactics for transitioning a company, getting them ready for, to go maybe overcome that resistance piece you were talking about?
Yeah. So the whole point is you're trying to lower that activation energy to commit to the change. And then you're also trying to activate the mycelium to buy into the change. My 2 favorite things at the moment is, and it's all about energy, really. People just want to, especially at the moment, we're all a bit knackered. And everyone wants to use the least energy possible. It's a very human trait. And you have to work with that. So instead of telling everyone they should be incredibly rah-rah and come to work and do a million things, you've got to find what's the easiest way to make this change happen in this environment with these people. And so we use something called relational infrastructure. And it's almost like the relational infrastructure you need to build hard infrastructure. And so you can run it at 3 different levels. So we've done stuff at the contractual level, which is trying to set out rules which are focused on building the relationships that are needed. So actually making it easy, because one of the biggest problems you have is you come post-contract and there's nothing to make it easy for you to learn and adapt and make changes as you go along to make those errors. So you need to build that space into your contractual mechanisms. So making sure learning from experiences in there, making sure knowledge transfer is built into the contract. How is the consultant who's working on this piece of work actively transferring knowledge back into the contract at the whole time? And that's a lot of the work we're doing at the moment, is active transfer of knowledge during the contractual process. And then there's a procedural. So the procedural is sort of co-creating ways of working that align to the people that are there. And you need to make it so that those can evolve over time. Again, there's tripping over, but also there's quite a large change of personnel now, and there's quite a lot of changes in policy, and there's all sorts of changes that occur over the lifespan of your project. And people seem to think that you put a process in it should stay. But the reality is that the process needs to evolve with the people. You change the people, you change the process. You've got a different company as soon as you have a new person in, especially in any of your key influential roles. And so building that into the procedural is part of the process. And so we did that, say, even way back when we were doing the Blue Book for TfL and HS2. We had an owner for each of the different procedural exercises, areas. So someone who knew everything about infrastructure protection, someone who knew everything about bus stops. If they wanted to change the processes in their area, they had complete ability to do that. So we found the key person and we got it agreed that they could update their processes based on feedback, and we had feedback loops built in. And as soon as they made a change in one area, it infiltrated into every single work package, because everyone came through a front door where those processes sat and lived, and they owned it on their playbook. We just did it recently with the Partner for Transport with the playbook for sponsorship. We had people who owned it, and then we had a 6-month rolling cycle for making sure that they could, is this working? Do we need to update it? Is it aligned with how people are operating at the moment? What could we do better? Feedback loops built into the process. And then the final one is people, which is around is like the communication and engagement, the you said we did type concept, bridging the gap between action and actually doing the work, and around behaviors and culture. And that one we use a lot of thinking partnerships where you're sitting alongside the person who's doing the work, but you're just helping them think their way through it without having the hierarchical issues getting in the way. So you can just have an honest conversation where you're like, right, I mean, Mick does this work in our organization, and he can get right the way down to what color are you wearing to give this message. I think you need to be in red, and you need to be saying it this way. And these are the people to watch for in the room when you're saying it, because they're the people who've got their arms crossed at the moment, and we need to bring them into the equation. So we're always thinking about it in those 3 sort of levels. And then we do the strategic interventions, which is change the least possible. Like, what is the absolute fundamental thing that needs to change here? And often the thing that needs to change is the formal process to match what people are already doing. People have a way of, a bit like water, will find the way to the easiest pathway. And as long as that easiest pathway is heading you in the right direction, getting rid of a few of the stones in the way is probably the best thing you can possibly do, and will get you the best result. And you're always just thinking, what's core? And I'm going to flex on absolutely everything else. If you want to call this the Fred process, I really don't care. I'm not going to sit there and fuss over whether it has some technical name or it has something that, matches best practice. You call it whatever you like, as long as that means you own it and it's getting done what we need it to get done. So it's really those sort of 3 layers, and then really working with how people want to operate and making sure there's something in it for everybody.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Joe. Firstly, I don't think leave any naming of anything to Val, because you'll end up with a mouthful like Project Chatter podcast. But jokes aside, I think, my mind goes to starting with, why would a organization engage with a consultant in the first place, right? And I think you kind of touched it on it there. And I've been a client. I'm now a consultant. And the reason I jumped the fence is I felt that I wasn't getting what I call true consultancy. So for me, as the client, I expected, if I'm paying a premium for someone to come in rather than using someone internally, that they have superior knowledge, experience, know-how, and can advise me of how to do things better. And that but what I found was, I was training consultants, so I'm paying them more and I'm teaching them. And that was the wrong way around. And maybe it's that some clients are just lazy, and to Val's point, perhaps they just don't want the accountability. Because if the project fails, it's not me, Gov. I got the consultant in and we need a new one now, and let's do another framework, or let's go and get another tender out there. Maybe. Not always, but maybe. I don't know. There are times as well where it's just easier, because if the project is going to go up and then go down, and we don't want to potentially have this big staff retention problem because we have all of these people and we don't know where they're going to go. If they're coming from a consultancy, we can just offload them and just give them the notice. And it's just easier. So I think there's a whole host of various aspects to consider where it's the why would you engage with an external organization. But for me, I think what you're saying in terms of insourcing is that there's actually a lot of work that can be and should be insourced for a number of positive reasons for the organization. And that it's just almost become a go-to to just get someone in to do it, rather than to think, okay, what's the impact of getting that person in to do that specific activity, task, role, whatever it might be. So just some of my thoughts as you're talking there.
Yeah. I just think one of the biggest issues we've got is that we've outsourced to such an extent that clients are finding it hard to client.
Yes.
Because they haven't actually had to do it themselves for a while. And so, or else they just haven't had the apprenticeship methodology that most of the boomers sort of went through. They kind of started on the track and told us about it all the time and worked their way up through the organization. And then we got the real benefit of having their expertise train us as we came through. I think there's a little bit of a gap. X is quite a small little gyration. And I think lots of people became project managers straight out of university, or became a policy person, or so missed that kind of the hard yards of learning the craft and knowing the difficulties of doing that work, and also walked into a world where everything was outsourced. So you had these wonderfully competent consultants around you who could just pick it up and always sounded very confident and could just do the work on your behalf, and then you're just signing the check. And the thing is that it takes a good consultant to pick up what we were talking about earlier, Val, with the Deloitte conversation. It takes someone with the capability and the capacity. Again, this do more with less. The not wanting to have too many people on your permanent staff means that you can often have situations where you have like a handful of actual client people on a project who are trying to look at a consultancy body of hundreds. And that's just too much for a single person to take on. And then they want to up the number of people who are in the client role, but that transferring across from consultants who have a lot of stake in making sure that people are dependent on them. So I think as consultants, especially in some of the larger consultancies, we've created a dependence methodology where either you've got all the knowledge sitting in your organization, or you're making it very easy for the client to not have you there. You become like their best mate, and they want to make sure they can always ask you. It's a bit like the ChatGPT, your AI bot that's becoming your new girlfriend from all accounts across the world. It's that sort of relationship that's sort of sitting there, and there's such a need for our clients to be clienting and to rebuild their capability and to have enough capacity to actually do that role. I can't tell you how many people sit from one Teams meeting to the next. Like, how do you have time to think? How do you have time to check that report that came in that's 50 pages, that's been written by 20 different people, or ChatGPT in this case? You're just trusting that they know better than you, and you're signing it off, and then you find out afterwards that it just doesn't work. So I just think, I don't know quite know where I'm going with that one, but
well, let's try and break it down a little bit. You mentioned, you brought up a word. It probably is a word. But if it isn't, we've made one up on the Project Shadow podcast. Hinting. What does that mean? How does a client learn to client? Like what are the gaps? If I'm a client, what does that look like? What does it feel like? So let's say I'm working for a client organization. I'm listening to this podcast. I go, yep, Joe, I agree with you. We need to have more internal capability and outsource less. How do I go about doing that? What does that look like? Where do I start?
I mean, I think the key element of a client is decision making. Like, that's your job, is to make decisions in reality. And so you can get as much advice as you like from whatever sources you like. At the end of the day, the buck stops with you to make decisions. And the problem is that to make decisions, you need to have the right information, and then you need to have the right context that you're sitting in. So you're the only one who can really understand the full political situation that you're in. That's generally dictating a lot of the decision making that you're making. And I think we've set ourselves up in a lot of our organizations to disperse accountability to the point. And so for me, and also we're sitting with a lot of technology that's kind of making decisions for us, whether we mean it to or not. So that's not even the fancy new technology. That's things like, SAP procurement, really hard to hire somebody who isn't on a particular framework. So therefore, I can't get the consultant that I want, or the piece of knowledge, or the whatever supply chain that I want, because I'm trapped in a technological system that sort of says, sorry, you can't do that. And the energy level needed to be able to change that is different. So for me, it's, if you want to be a better client, I don't think this is an individual sport. You can't just decide by yourself, I'm going to be a better client and I'm going to read a couple of books and I'm going to have a bit of knowledge and I'm going to make a few more decisions. I mean, yes, please make a few more decisions and just take accountability if you get it wrong. This is the child tripping over. Sometimes you just have to start making decisions. But I think you need to do it as a team sport. I think you need to find others within the organization who you can work together going, right, we're going to grab a hold of this. You've got to try and get more people over the side of the fence going, this side of the fence is nicer than that side of the fence. Let's have a few more clients on this side of the fence who have that capability. Go and look for people with skills. Get yourselves, somebody who can be your thinking partner, whether it's from internal within your organization, who's someone who you really admire what they know, and that you need that sort of backup to help you second guess yourself. Because I think, sometimes it's a really lonely job being a client, or you do get, an independent voice from externally to give you a bit of a hand, to help you really think through, but make decisions. Really get yourself as much knowledge as you possibly can in order to make the right decisions, but don't spend too much time worrying about them. I think you sort of think at the moment, I feel like, we're sitting with a government that's trying to win A stars by getting the exact right way to go forward and then just not stepping forward. And it's clogging up our government at the moment. And you think, if we could just, I actually would prefer you to make some bad decisions, but get us moving than not make decisions. And for me, that's fundamental about clienting. Of anything else, that one's your key thing.
One of the challenges, Joe, we have that I can see is in Australia, we consume a lot of consulting time. Like if you were to break it down by hours per agency and branch, we have another challenge of about, I think it's about, I don't know what every state is like, but Victoria, I think it's about 60% of the work that's out there on projects is government funded to some degree, direct or indirect. And the government agencies themselves would say to you probably that they're overinflated by resources. And so the question I'll have, even if we wanted to bring the consultants in-house, is back to your point around capability and capacity, but also they've kind of capped out. It's not unusual for us to be called in because they've got a hiring freeze. They're not able to do it, as you said. There's back to your procurement conversation, like they are stuck and they need the help. What's your kind of antidote or message there? Like how can they get out of that? It feels like a stuck spot. If I put my client hat on, I'd struggle clienting in that environment because you're stuck and you probably don't have the highest productivity in the team, and it's very hard to fire people in the government as well.
Well, I think there's this concept of this bigger is better. Like the more people we have, the more work will get done. But if you look at it through a relationship lens, the more people you have, the less work gets done. Because you've got to deal with a whole lot more relationships, and relationships take time, and they often accidentally create their own work. And you end up managing the relationships rather than managing the project. And so what I worked with this brilliant man, Richard Johnston, for quite a chunk of my career. And his solution to pretty much everything is just have a heck of a lot less. He thinks you can run pretty much any major project with about 30 people, especially for the beginning stage. He's like, just choose the right 30 and only have 30. So really being careful about I hesitate to use the word con because I think that's too strong a word, but being lured by the concept of I can bring you in hundreds of consultants that's going to get this job done really fast and we can get it done. Trust the fact that you pick the right set of experts who really know their stuff, and you'll find that your people around you who you've decided are incompetent but actually have just stopped engaging will start engaging because they've got good people around them who know what they're doing, which is the knowledge that you're bringing to yourselves. And you can activate your own mycelium again by having a lot more purpose and a lot more control, by having a smaller number of relationships to manage. And so for me, it's like, do more with less, bite the bullet and have a significant number of people reduced in terms of the consultants that you're utilizing. And get down to just a handful and figure out what the basics are. There's a really interesting thing that I was reading the other day, which was when rendering first came out, 3D rendering of drawings. And all these architects would draw these most amazing 3D renderings. And it would look like a finished product within, a very short period of time compared to what you used to have to do to get to that stage of design. It was like, this is amazing. This is going to save us so much time. This is going to be incredible. We've got this tool that can make it look like we're finished. But the problem is they hadn't gone through the thinking process in doing that. And actually, lots of architects have gone back, the best ones have gone back. I think it was Rem Koolhaas who was talking, they were talking about, and he went back to like matchboxes and, little sticks and making models, because the core thing was, how is this going to fit together? How, what's the really core thing we need to think about? I think we need to do that. We need to take that concept back into our organizational thinking is, what's the matchsticks and the, hand making the model yourself with the least number of people, where you really get the basics right before you add anything on, because we're often adding the shine on before we figured out the structure. And so get rid of the shine and get back to the structure.
I agree with that, because we have a small team that focus on design thinking, and part of that concept is not just being human centered, but it's around rapid prototyping. So you would prototype with low fidelity, like maybe use cardboard or something interactive instead of like a dashboard on a screen, so people can press things and play things. And it's creative. It gets people out of their chairs. I think there's something to that, especially because it's a human sport, delivering projects. I think everyone gets so wrapped up in doing things online that they forget that, and you've said this before, Joe, it's people that deliver projects, not process or tools. And how many times have we seen a project delivered because of heroic efforts of the collective, engineers, designers, testing teams out there in the middle of nowhere? It's interesting that you say that. And then the other challenge is I think there is a fear of accepting accountability. You mentioned before about just making decisions, and there's almost a culture, if you like, of people who are not willing to sign off on literally anything. And now, as you said, the boomers are kind of slowly retiring, even if they don't want to. Some of them are holding on, like they want to go. I've got 70-year-old consultants out there going, I got a few more years left, and I was like, guys, just let go. Yeah, we've got this, So as we kind of come up,
a lot of you,
which I love them, but their stories are too long, I'm like TLDR, So as we kind of grow into these more senior roles, and we're talking to more senior clients, I guess they're kind of this same generation. I wonder how the youth think about these things, and this is where I wanted to kind of pivot a bit. When we think about clienting and insourcing, go back to the theme, I have a question. I'm not sure how to form it, but it's around the youth, because they don't see careers the same way. They don't look at experience and time the same way. I could almost argue that everyone that I speak to in the project setting that's kind of around my age or my generation, we kind of have a general relative theory around experience and effort and resilience and getting battle scars and going out there and doing hard stuff and working your way through the top. You kind of have to have that earning period before you can. But a lot of the youth that I talk to don't want to do that. They just want the answers. And it's this almost immediate gratification of, the ChatGPT society. Like, if I want to know something, I just want to go somewhere and get it immediately. And I guess to some degree in the past, the proxy has always been the consultant. The consultant's been the proxy, because they've said, you can go to a consultant and say, hey, how do you do this? Then they're resourceful enough to figure it out for you. How do we get them to think about insourcing the way you are? Because I also feel like they struggle with this concept.
Humans are humans are humans are humans. I mean, I don't buy into this whole concept that the next generation is different, etc. They're just doing exactly what we spoke about at the beginning. They're reacting to their context. So their context is a lot less certainty within the job world. They need to be a lot more agile. They need to be able to react to the fact that you don't get a job for life anymore. And they're sitting there going, why should I commit all of my energy to something which may not actually love me back? And so I think they can be motivated in the exact same way as all of us are motivated, which is through having a sense of purpose and a sense of, I'm here to do something. And I think actually insourcing may provide some of that sense of purpose if you can have more stability in a job, because a lot of that work is sitting inside your organization rather than going outside of your organization. Possibly that will be an attractive thing, is to have actually some certainty in your work and to have a longevity and to be trained. And I wouldn't be surprised if we go back to, and you can feel it already happening, is this idea of apprenticeships, proper apprenticeships that you can join and physically do something and get involved. I think they're just reacting to the reality that you don't have a guaranteed job at the end of going to university. It used to be a concept, and I think it was a very short period of time that it was a concept. It just happens to be the one we came through, where you'd go to university and therefore you'd get a degree, and when you got a degree, you get a job, and then once you got a job, you move your way up a ladder. The context has changed, so they're reacting to the changed context. I think they're just as capable of being either engaged or disengaged as we are. And for all the exact same reasons that we get engaged or disengaged. It's just that we're at a different point within our career. And also noticeably all run our own companies, which I think is actually X being very different to Boomer. Just from the context that we grew up in, lots of us have decided that to get the flexibility of work that we'd like to be able to do and to have the purpose, we've gone out into creating our own SMEs. And I think in the same way, the next generation will react to their context and will come up with a mechanism that works for them, and probably a much more sensible one, because it's probably going to, having watched the mistakes of us trying to do it all, especially on the female side, where we decided we could raise kids and also run big careers and somehow, bake and do all sorts of weird shit that we thought doing sourdough was really important. Like, actually, I'll just do something that I enjoy, do it well. So I'm looking forward to what they do. And also, we're in a point of transition. Like, this is where we can feel it. All the existing systems are having a little rattle. Our belief in the existing institutions is changing. This is their moment to create new ones. And I don't see why the concept of insourcing may not be the right term. It could be something completely different, but we still need to run our infrastructure, and we still need to build things, and that still needs people coming together to do that. And these are the ones who are going to do it. And I think they'll be just as purposeful and just as driven as we've been, just maybe in ways we don't necessarily recognize.
Maybe I'm being a little bit naughty when I say this, but maybe the other thing that drives grit, determination, loyalty, and longevity in a role is a recession or high unemployment, or when it's really tough to make a living and you don't get the dole and you need to go out and work and hold a job and to be able to afford to live. And that builds a bit of resilience and grit and determination. Because when you have options and they come easy, it's easy to jump from one to the other. And the easier you make that jump, the more you find people jump. The harder the jump is, the fewer people make the jump. But also you build up a level of resilience, because now you have to put up with the shit aspects of your role, because there's a greater need to hold the job down. I don't know. Maybe we're talking about sort of socioeconomics now, and human behavior, and how to make the world a better place. I don't know, but I think there's a lot to be said around generational shifts, right? We talk about the boomers, we talk about sort of our generation and the next generation coming in, and there's not much I think we can really change about the influences of the generations coming in, because it is what it is. They've grown up with social media, instant gratification. They've grown up with choice. Do you remember we couldn't go onto Netflix and choose the shows? We had to wait for the specific time slot in the evening for The Simpsons to come on that day, and you had to make sure you were there. You couldn't just choose the music you wanted on Spotify, right? You didn't have a mobile phone. You had to remember your friend's number, and you used to have to dial it in with your finger, and press all the buttons or turn the dial. So that won't come back, right? Those old days, or making ourselves all feel old now, probably. So it's how do we deal with that going forward, and how does that play into insourcing? Because the idea of insourcing is coupled with longevity, with people staying put and not jumping. In some respects, because, and I love it if you're going to disagree, I see you shaking your head there, Joe, because my thinking is that if we're saying that people retain the knowledge and the experiences, and the advantages of insourcing is the retention of that knowledge and how that happens, then regardless of how we store that knowledge, because we might be able to store it better now and retrieve it easier, whoever picks it up still has to learn it.
I don't think, yes, ideal wise, wonderful if you have people who stay in organizations for long periods of time and hold that knowledge. Although I always remember that whole concept of, you either have 30 years experience or 1 year of experience 30 times. So whether people are learning through that process is probably the more important part. I think we do these things rather than handover plans nowadays. We call them adoption and adaptation plans. And so much of that is, one, how do we make sure that the the piece of work that's being done is being adopted internally, and then how do we set it up so it can adapt fast. And the reality is that organizations, especially during a period like what we're going through at the moment, are changing so rapidly that even if it's the same person, they can't apply the knowledge that they have particularly easily. Actually, their greatest skill is their ability to agilely deal with what comes at them. So it's as much about an attitude and an ability to think laterally and having good relationships so you can pick up the phone to someone in another department and go, oh, how are we going to deal with this one? It's just come over the fence. And so the fear is the lack of relationships. I think the longevity for me is more about if you constantly have people coming in and out, then you don't get the longevity of relationships. But I'd be really interested in seeing the statistics on how long people do stay in some of these bigger organizations and whether people would be more inclined to stay in them if there was more certainty and if there was more pipeline of work. And I do feel we're getting to the end of the concept of everything being a project. I think we've hit peak project, and we're going to think about things as more long term. I mean, you could think about what's happened on the railways as a series of projects, or you could actually think about it as just being running a railway that needs to be fixed every now and again. And I think the project mentality has probably led to some of the jumping, whereas actually if you change the way that you perceive the work you're doing, potentially you'll get people who are very happy to stay and be interested for long periods of time. Again, humans are humans are humans. You change the environment that they're in and they will be more inclined to stay around. But you can very easily work with changes of staff. You have to plan for it, and you do need to make use of your technology properly, and you do need to store your knowledge properly, and you do need to generously share your relationships when new people come in so that they can get up to speed quickly. But I don't think you have to have a series of lifetimers to make an organization work effectively. New blood's good.
I'll share something I talked to Lawrence Roland about in a wild podcast that Dale and I got carried away with. Down the AI trap, I'm pretty convinced people are going to have relationships with AI, like deep and meaningful ones. And I also believe that, and we're starting to see this, that organizations will have agents as part of a hybrid team rather than outsourcing. Maybe this is part of your insourcing solution, because the knowledge transfer will only solve part of the problem, because knowledge transfer suggests you know the problem and you know how to solve it. But emergent problems, you'll have no knowledge. You'll have to learn how to solve them on the go. So you'll always need some type of resolution. And if it's insourced, you may still not have the capability or the capacity. So AI can help bridge that, perhaps. I think then it would be interesting to me to understand your viewpoint on how do you deal with those kinds of relationships, because effectively we're going to have an army of agents now running governments or police's forces or, the bakery, whatever it's going to be. I just wanted to know, how do we ensure that humans still make the decisions? Because the risk here is, back to your point, like the idea is that you want to make informed decisions, in-source them, make it in-house, do more with less. AI ticks a lot of those boxes, but if it makes the decisions, then what's the point of having people in that whole organization in the first place?
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting because I read something which was a bit highfalutin and I'm not sure if I completely understood it, but effectively it said AI is abstraction, whereas humans are connection. And my reading of the word abstraction in that point is that AI is incredibly good at finding patterns and trends and putting, and using that to put effectively what I'd call as the scaffolding of a project or the guardrails of a project. So it can kind of say, here are the steps. I can see you're trying to do this and we can do X, Y, and Z. But the problem is that AI by its nature is distancing. So, but you need both. When you don't go into a project and do it completely by relationships, unless there's only 3 of you working. As soon as you get to a certain number, you need to have processes, you need procedures, you need ways of working, because we need some rules to make sure we all head in the same direction. And so AI is brilliant at that. It does some fabulous work in that. And it picks up patterns of relationships as well. So it can be someone that you have a relationship with. I'd say it'd probably be a low-calorie relationship. Because as much as we hate to admit it, the things that we value most in our relationships is to do with friction. And there's no friction with AI in any form, in terms of you don't have an argument with AI. You don't have to then make up. You don't learn as you go along in terms of really understanding where someone's completely different viewpoint comes from. They're basically telling you you're wonderful and great at all times. And I have to actually tell my AI to stop. I'm Australian. I can't cope with it. I need you to be slightly sarcastic. Can you please not tell me I've done what a great question that is, because I feel like you're being rude. And so I just, as much as I think we'll get sucked into AI relationships, and plenty of people will be, I think they will feel deeply unfulfilling and pull you away from connection. And so how do you solve for that? And I think that's across the board in how AI is used. I think AI has some phenomenal potential. I think we need to keep, and for me, this concept of abstraction versus connection is a really strong one that sits in my mind at all times when I'm playing with AI. And the question I ask constantly is the way that I'm using AI creating human connection, or is it creating abstraction or more abstraction? And so I think it's how we choose to use the AI that becomes deeply fundamentally important. It can be used to bring people together. And so we're looking at it with one company at the moment where we're talking to them. They've already got people who are creating AI bots, but no one's using them properly. And so, I mean, they're enjoying playing with them, but they're not using them to increase productivity within the organization. And so we're going in to have a little look to say, well, what can you do? You've got these incredibly brilliant people. We're creating AI bots based on their knowledge. How do we get people to draw down on that in the right way? And like for us, a lot of that is, how are you going to get it so that someone actually goes and talks to the person that AI bot is based on as a human to human connection, where you can talk randomly about the cricket or have some random conversation that we'd never expect to have, and also get the job done. So it's like, I think we've got to make sure that connection stays involved in the process, and we don't let ourselves treat abstraction as connection.
I have a bit of a Black Mirror moment then, thinking about why that wouldn't work. It's because it's like talking to a stranger, yeah, who's ignorant of themselves. So like, because AI isn't self-aware, it cannot read the room. Let's put it that way. But I know that I could train with enough time, Joe, an AI agent or bot, probably bot to some degree, the ins and outs of the workings of the brain, not all of it, and personality of Joe. I actually think there's something like holding up a mirror. You would have more of a debatable, frictionless or frictional or discussion with yourself than you would with someone you don't know. I know that's true because if Dale and I had a version of ourselves, it would drive us insane, but we would have very productive conversations. Because we are critical thinkers, right? And I think there's something that's missing in the kind of what we have today. But I do think at some point we could have a very deep mirror version of you, Joe, sitting on a laptop, and you could have a very, very constructive conversation. You would feel some sort of, even if it's not real, connection with it, because it's challenging you, right? There's some value in resistance. That's why people are interesting, because when you have a debate or you have a conversation about something of interest, you feel refreshed after it, right? It's like it is part of the human condition to be in that back and forth interaction. You know, that's our signal, right? That's our send and receive piece. I do think we'll get there, but I'd love to hear Dale's view on it as well, and yours, Joe.
Can I just finish off in terms of AI is picking up what we, especially as sort of Western oriented people, see as the most important thing, which is language. And yes, so much of our connection comes through language. And yes, I'm sure you could have a very good conversation. And I've got no issues with us exploring that, because I think there's so many minds I'd love to get into AI. I've got no issues with AI. Like, don't read but at the end of the day, we have all the other senses. And I think we undervalue them and don't even notice them in terms of the smells that you have. Like, you realize that when you're talking on a screen in Teams, the difference between this conversation and if we were sitting at the pub is huge. And it's really hard to say what's different, because we can hold a really great conversation this way and it's really fulfilling and it has a lot of the aspects, but you can feel the disconnect that's happened to people who had to go through working on Teams for 2 years during COVID. And you can feel it's 34 times more impactful to have a face-to-face meeting than to write an email. So I'm not sure where a Teams meeting comes in that spectrum, but it's sitting somewhere in the middle. And that's because we read the room with our whole bodies and we experience other people with our whole bodies. And I think we don't like talking about it because it's slightly woo-woo and it feels slightly uncomfortable. But I think we're making a mistake if we think that AI can fully replicate proper human connection. purely through the visual and the voice.
Yeah, it's artificial by nature, if there is any connection. But if you think about what you're saying, both you and Val, the AI we have right now is basically like locking a person in a room from birth and teaching them, or just giving them books to read, right? And they've never seen trees or the sky or what a person looks like or dog or a cat. They've just seen the words being described, and they're just reading these words. And then, it's like typing to them on a screen, and they're typing back because they just see words coming back and forth. They've never experienced it. They've never smelt it. Never heard it. So interesting concept. And I think, I was reading interesting. I know we're going down the AI rabbit hole, but I forgot the person's name. One of the godfathers, or someone that's attributed to being a godfather of AI, has said that we'll only really reach true AGI potentially when we get the full potential of AI to use vision, so use cameras and being able to see what it's trying to talk about, so it can contextualize it rather than just the words. But look, it's been a fascinating conversation. The other thing that I think went through my head, Joe, was when you're saying, how clients need to be clients again, and insource is what was the irony in that they might need to outsource in order to be able to insource. So
There's definitely that with that.
we need to outsource people to help us insource. So yeah, but look, fascinating. You always bring such interesting, intriguing thoughts to the listeners of the Project Chatter podcast. And this is another one. I remember when you first sat with me going, I want to talk about this insourcing and how we can sort of navigate it. And Val and I are both going, wow, actually it really gets the juices flowing. But look, we are heading towards the end of the pod, and was there anything else that you were mulling over around this insourcing idea that we haven't covered?
I think we've covered most of it. I mean, my main one is just this concept of, I'm not saying we have to insource. That's not, I think I just am acknowledging, I almost see a lot of the work we do as anthropologists. You're sort of watching what's actually happening as opposed to, and predicting where it's going. And I think this is just one of those ebbs and flows, is that we go through periods where everything gets outsourced and we go through periods where things get insourced. And I think the main thing is recognizing, well, how do you react to that? How do you make the most of that situation? How do you support that? Rather than trying to say that I think things should be insourced. Is probably the main concept I probably haven't got across particularly well. I'm not bidding for it. I'm just saying that's where we're heading.
Yeah.
And so it puts a lot of us out of jobs. So it's not something that I've said it to a few people in larger organizations, and they're like, whoa, we don't want to be going there. We're really happy about this news. So I'm just putting a marker in saying, I think we're heading this direction, as opposed to saying we should be heading in this direction.
Well, the beauty is we're recording this and we can always come back and revisit it. As you know, the door is always open. But look, thank you very much for bringing this to the table and sort of, allowing us to explore this with you. It was certainly a great thought exercise, I felt, and I'm sure values feel the same. But look, before we let you go, Joe, with any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Make more decisions. Do more with less. No. I mean, I think, as always, I love the fact that we went down some wonderful rabbit holes. Really enjoy the AI digging around the edges of it, because I just think there's so much more to go in that space. And as always, an incredibly deep pleasure to talk to both of you.
Likewise, the privilege and pleasure is all ours. Val, any final thoughts from you?
No, it's good to see you again, Joe. It's too far between catch-ups, so we're going to have to catch up again. I think we could have done a series of these. Maybe we can bring them up again in the next season. Lots to capture, actually. I think the topic was really useful as a mechanism for thought change, right? So people need to have a discussion about this. But I'm great that you brought to the front line, Joe. Appreciate it.
There we have it, folks. That is the end of this episode. But if you like what you've heard, please do help us pay it forward and share a link to this episode on your favorite social media. Once again, a massive thank you to Joe Lucas, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From Val and me, it's bye for now.